We had a former planning commissioner in Fayetteville who used to comment that with our population projections, we have built half of our city right now. I mean, half the housing units in the city don't exist yet. So the decisions we're making right now are incredibly important, and they're going to have an extreme impact, maybe even an outsized impact, depending how we decide to do it.
You're listening to The Underview, an exploration of the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and today we are taking another step closer to how our place is being shaped by looking at how decisions are made within the cities. Today, we're releasing 2 episodes to give 2 different perspectives from 2 different cities and 2 different types of roles. I would encourage you to listen to both because you'll see how these different perspectives are helping to form the uniqueness of Northwest Arkansas. In this episode, I visit the city of Fayetteville, where I have the privilege to sit with Jonathan Curth, who serves as the Development Services Director for the city of Fayetteville. For the past 7 years, Jonathan has worked and now oversees the city's development services as a part of the city staff. 7 years is a long time to make an impact on the city, but it sounds like he's just getting started because the city of Fayetteville released their City Plan 2040 this week, and that includes housing goals to try and minimize suburban sprawl and create more options for affordable, or called attainable housing. You'll find a link for Fayetteville's City Plan 2040 in the show notes. I think you'll hear why Fayetteville's planning and land use philosophy is different, and for good reason. In the other episode I released this week, I focus on my hometown of Bentonville. I meet with Rod Sanders, who's been on the Bentonville Planning Commission for the past 10 years. I could argue there hasn't been much happened in the Bentonville in the last 10 years that hasn't passed first through the Bentonville Planning Commission and had Rod's eyes on. Remember, this discussion isn't about zoning as some technical detail of government, but a discussion about how we create communities that include or exclude people. Long before you see our neighborhoods and communities change, this is where it all begins. And then after the chat with Jonathan, I asked longtime friend John Ray to give me a bike tour of his hometown of Fayetteville. I want to see Fayetteville through the eyes of someone who has been there for a long time, someone who cares deeply about his city, and someone who's involved in helping make long-term decisions about how this city meets the challenges of growth ahead. Time is precious today, so let's jump in with both feet. Thank you for sitting down at the table with me. I very much appreciate it. It's great to meet you. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You bet.
Appreciate your interest.
I'd love to start maybe with a little bit about yourself. I ask people, tell me your story.
Sure. It was, I get asked that oftentimes. I think a lot of people consider themselves amateur city planners and wonder how professional city planners come about their jobs. Mine was a little bit of a circuitous route. In undergrad, I thought I wanted to work for the State Department. I thought I wanted to be a diplomat, take my foreign service exam. Accordingly, I went and got a degree in international relations and global studies and a minor in Spanish. And then I started paying a closer attention to national politics and how a given administration interacts with the various departments of government. And it left me feeling kind of disenchanted. Followed my future wife to her graduate school program in the Kansas City area, started taking some courses, the urban or the city university there in urban geography, and then city planning. And at some point, a professor said, what are you doing surveying these courses? You have a knack for it. You need to go to grad school for planning. So I did. I went to the University of Kansas. I got my master's degree, came back working in the Kansas City area for a while. I'm from Tulsa. My wife's from Fort Smith. And so I saw a position come open in Fayetteville. I looked into its planning philosophies quite a bit more, and it seemed like an excellent fit. I applied, was offered, and here I've been now for 7.5 years.
Well, you wanted to be a diplomat. Those skills must come in handy while you're here in this role.
Certainly, yeah. And when it comes to urban planning, a lot of people break it down into kind of 2 schools of thought. There's the urban designers, and then there's the policy planners. And I'm definitely more on the policy side of things. Urban design is fascinating to me, but I recognize that my chops are mostly in how we write laws that translate to the urban environment, and that definitely fits in well with the political discussion.
Absolutely. Tell me, what does Arkansas mean to you?
That's a great question. So, I mean, as a born and bred Okie, I don't have a whole lot of loyalty to my home state, but Arkansas has certainly grown on me. I went to undergraduate school at Hendrix and Conway, so I got my first exposures to it while I was there. Tried to get out into the state, into the wild every single weekend we could. Obviously, I married an Arkansan, so I kept feeling the pull back to the state. I think, if nothing else, the natural side of the state is what represents it the most in my mind. When I think of Arkansas, I think of the outdoors, and Fayetteville as an extension of that, given its prioritization on trying to make sure there's still a lot of real healthy tree canopy in the city, and that we're trying to minimize our impacts on that natural outdoors.
Is this home for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I have 2 kids here now. I knew wherever I started putting my kids into schools where I would be committed to at least for close to 2 decades, and that's what I intend to do. I certainly think of it that way. I know the city as well as any place I've ever lived at this point. Close to 3/4 of a decade of looking at maps and moving around the city professionally and personally.
Tell me a little bit about the place where we're meeting. We're in your office, but where are we in Northwest Arkansas?
That's a good question. I guess I could answer that at a few different levels. I mean, we're in downtown Fayetteville. That right off the bat was one of the draws for me when I came for my interview years ago, was the fact that Fayetteville had committed to keeping their city administration in their downtown. A lot of cities of comparable size and different metropolitan areas have decided to move all their city staff out to the periphery where they can build a brand new shiny city hall in a suburban environment. Fayetteville has really committed in both in policy and in practice to trying to make this a more urban city, a more walkable, approachable city, and Fayetteville's downtown is definitely a manifestation of that.
Jonathan, you're the Development Services Director for the city of Fayetteville. Can you give me a little bit of background? What does that role entail?
Certainly. In a nutshell, this position oversees most of the city staff that are associated with development in the city. And that can take a lot of shapes and forms. That means our city planning staff, when you think of a property being rezoned or going for these cryptic terms like a large scale development or a site improvement plan. That's our planning group. They spearhead those with our other reviewers. I also oversee our long range planning group, which they're the stewards of our comprehensive land use plan. They're the ones who are digging into our code, making changes based on how we see our culture changing. They're also overseeing our historic preservation efforts. Perhaps the most nuts and bolts part of the group that I oversee is our building safety group. That's building permits. That's when you see people pouring concrete foundations, framing up houses. That also includes our code compliance group. So when somebody calls to complain about their neighbor's tall grass, that for better or worse also falls under my authority or my purview. And my responsibility is to make sure that it's all moving as smoothly as possible. Because despite having a lot of those different groups under one department, which is done for efficiency's sake, there are a lot of other people citywide and outside the city that participate in development review. I mean, it can be franchise utilities, it could be the county, it could be the school district, and trying to corral all those different groups into making sure they're giving comments in a timely manner and keeping projects moving forward is a challenge in itself. But then also, I consider it part of my main charge to make sure that we're not ever just standing still, that we're recognizing where we're inefficient, where there are changing trends in our city that are getting us caught flat-footed, whether it's rising housing costs or concerns about traffic congestion, whatever it may be, or even little tweaks in our ordinances that can save a project weeks or months at a time. All of that is something that I try to keep at the forefront of my mind.
It sounds like there's not a whole lot of slow days around your office, are there?
No, that's my common statement. My staff could probably repeat it as soon as they know it's coming. Is my favorite and least favorite thing about the job is that there's never a boring day ever.
Well, maybe that's a testament to the work that is happening, but it's probably also, realistically, just a symptom of the growth that Northwest Arkansas and Fayetteville is experiencing. And maybe we start there. I'd love to get your perspective, since you obviously coming from Arkansas, but also within this role, kind of the change that you've seen. What have you seen change if you can sum it up into words.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, there are so many different changes and how they interact with each other is hard to summarize really well. I certainly can't put my finger on one particular thing that's causing the change or resulting from the change. But I think first and foremost, we are a college town. We're well, a city of only about 100,000, of which almost a third of that is in the University of Arkansas. So that has to be kept in mind. And that university has been growing quite consistently at about 1,000 kids a year for over a decade now, and that has a lot of impacts on the community. But that Fayetteville as a city and Northwest Arkansas as a region is also incredibly appealing beyond the discussion about higher education. There have been a lot of decisions made by forefathers and foremothers that have made this a very desirable place to live, whether it's in regards to the outdoors, employment, a combination of those things. So regardless of what's happening at the university, we're seeing a lot of growth in the city, and that creates a lot of tensions. It's causing a huge increase in housing prices, as I alluded to earlier. That's having a lot of impacts on people who've lived here for decades. Some people are being priced out of living in Fayetteville. They're having to move further and further away. Our students are often moving out into the community because there's not enough housing on campus. And so there's a lot of tensions to be seen there as well. I could go on, just that as you add more and more people, the dynamic and the equation gets more and more complicated on how it runs from day to day.
I'd be curious if you can draw, and I realize this may be opinion, but can you draw any assumptions about the people that are either new to the area or maybe some of the values that they hold or that may come across your desk as it relates to what change looks like here in Fayetteville?
Oh, I don't know. That's hard to say. I think I've heard a lot of very positive feedback from new arrivals about how interactive they feel like the city is, and that's an appeal to me too. When I was a new resident years ago, is it's a very approachable city. You can be as involved or disengaged as you want to be in Fayetteville. We take a lot of pride in having very active public processes, whether they're planning, whether they're public hearings or otherwise. So that is something I consistently hear, but it's consistently a challenge to improve upon it, because for every two or three people that we were able to accommodate participating, there's probably two or three people that can't because they're working multiple jobs, because they don't have any form of transportation to get to those meetings. I it is an interesting tension, but I think that outsiders definitely are drawn by how easy it is to move into the community and around the community once they're here.
Do you feel the responsibility to weigh that with people who have been here for a long time? How do those two worlds come together?
Yeah, they absolutely do. You only need to attend one public hearing to hear at least one person say, "I'm so and so. I live at such and such address," and then almost without fail, the next thing they'll tell you is how long they've lived in Fayetteville. And it's like that in a lot of cities. I don't want to suggest we're special in that way, but there definitely is a lot of weight given to people's voices who have been around for a long time. And for better or worse, that's codified in a lot of cities, including Fayetteville, where you have a public hearing and people are invited to comment on them. People that are invited are not your future residents who might be living in a subdivision or an apartment building that's not been built yet. It's inherently the people who already live there. So there's already, for lack of a kinder term, a bias for the people who currently live in a city. It's why a lot of cities are being caught flat-footed now with regards to housing. Most of our systems are set up to give the benefit of the doubt or exceptional input for people who live there now.
When you think of some of the priorities for the city as far as growth looks like, if we're looking at some estimates would say almost a million people by the year 2040, 2045. But as you think through some of that long range type of planning, what are some of the things that jump out to you as, hey, we really, in order to maintain the beauty of what Fayetteville is, these are some things that we really need to kind of hold out and examine and make sure that we understand. Are there any values or priorities that you think about in terms of that long term plan?
Absolutely. I mean, before opining on that, I think I like that you led that question off the way you did. We had a former planning commissioner in Fayetteville who used to comment that with our population projections, we have built half of our city right now. I mean, half the housing units in the city don't exist yet. So the decisions we're making right now are incredibly important, and they're going to have an extreme impact, maybe even an outsized impact, depending how we decide to do it. And with that in mind, I think some of the decisions Fayetteville began making in the early 2000s and that we are working to recommit and further ourselves towards are those fiscally responsible decisions with the land in the city. And by that, I mean, uh, are we going to continue to develop in low density, sprawling or suburban patterns? And I don't mean to diminish anybody's houses or where they live and say that's a bad thing, but it is an unfortunate fact that when you have one family or one person in one house on a quarter acre lot, it requires the same amount of water and sewer and street and fire and police service as a 8 unit building on a quarter acre in downtown. And one of those things is going to render an economic burden to the city, and one may make the city more economically buoyant. So I think that's probably the biggest piece of it is a lot of the decisions we need to make, we need to do fully aware of the consequences if we decide to develop in certain patterns and not others. We may not be able to continue building trails. We may not be able to continue buying our parkland that we assert we value that open space. We may not be able to invest in the arts like we're currently doing if in 30 years we're just having to focus on repaving streets over and over again and spending larger and larger amounts of our city budget on fuel for our fire and police departments. Uh, so to that end, I think a lot of Fayetteville's planning initiatives are how to accommodate growth towards our urban core. Most recently, we kicked off a project to rezone our former 71B corridor, which is College Avenue and South School. It's an enormous amount of land in the dead middle of our city on water, sewer, and street, but you can't build any housing today. And that's a reality we need to come to terms with and try to make the shift and to allow it otherwise.
Do you feel like there are any non-negotiables as you think through what future plans may look like?
Oh, if I'm guilty of anything, it's probably a willingness to see all sides of an argument. So I'm reluctant to say there are any non-negotiables. I think a housing first perspective is an important one. I personally and professionally believe that housing is a right and that the city should prioritize efforts to make sure our residents are housed. And I think we took a good step towards that last fall when we performed a housing assessment so that we actually had the information to know what our residents' needs are. Like how much money are people making? Who will need subsidized housing? Because that is a fact of where we are in housing prices right now. So I think if I were to say there's a non-negotiable, it's that. I realize that's a very broad remit, but I think it's something as a community we should really prioritize.
Can you maybe talk through that a little bit more? I'm curious, kind of the underlying reasons or kind of belief around what is the role of the city in creating housing opportunities, maybe versus the role of developers or local landowners, or yeah, how would you classify the role of the city in those spaces?
It's a fantastic question, and a common misconception is that the city builds things. We build parks, we build police stations, we put in water and sewer lines and streets. We don't build housing. We're not Vienna, Austria. We don't build McDonald's. We don't build office buildings. And the public often perceives that if there's a housing need, the city should be building housing. In the United States, that's simply not a very common role for cities. Doesn't mean it can't happen necessarily. It varies by state what statutes allow cities to do. But that's not to say that there's not a role for a city. I definitely don't want to give that impression. The primary role for cities when it comes to land use is we have established, or we do establish, the framework for what can be built where, what it can look like, how big it can be, how small it can be, what can go inside of it. And those are our zoning and development codes. Some unusual ones we have in Fayetteville are uh, not unusual. And actually, the it's pretty common nationally. Is we have a lot of land that's zoned for single family homes at very low densities. That's inherently expensive because land is expensive. Another piece of that is we have ordinances that speak about how many people can live in a housing unit in Fayetteville. And that's a product of us being a college town. There's a lot of concerns about too many students cramming into a house, and you've got a stealth dorm or a de facto fraternity, or wherever else the mind goes with that. But it also has impacts almost comparable to single family zoning, where we're effectively telling people what a family looks like, and how many people can be in a house, which can push people into more spread out housing arrangements that consume more land and are less efficient with it, and force people out of housing in a lot of instances. And that's one piece of it. The city also, at least in Fayetteville, we play an active role financially. We try to put our money where our mouth is, supporting organizations and groups in their endeavors. Seven Hills in Fayetteville, New Beginnings as well. It sometimes comes in the form of direct funding. Sometimes it's more indirect. We try to cost share improvements to their properties, whether if they need a new sewer line or extend a sewer line, we may be able to pay for it all or pay for some of it. And I think it all comes with the realization that not only are these humans, and there's a baseline reason to house them, but also not housing them has a cost to it as well. In fact, is in a lot of conversations about criminal justice, for instance, it's a lot more expensive to keep a human incarcerated than it is to put them in a house. And I think a lot of those things have factored into Fayetteville's decisions in the last decade or decades to try to fund some of these initiatives where possible.
Do you feel like the decisions to fund those types of initiatives, especially for maybe those without a home, comes as a result of the planning department's recommendation for good city planning? Or is that out of the political will, I dare say generosity of the people of Fayetteville? Or how does that work? How do those decisions get made?
That's a good question, and as a self-deprecating planner, I acknowledge that a lot of the reason we have homelessness and housing challenges in Fayetteville is because of the zoning and planning decisions we made decades and decades ago. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, our federal government really prioritized single-family, low-density construction, and we fully incorporated that into a lot of our land use planning, and did not really start to move away from that until the 2000s. And we're still quite committed to it if you look at a zoning map in Fayetteville. So in that regard, I think it's a sins of our fathers kind of situation where planning has contributed to the homelessness problem, not as individuals necessarily, but as a profession or as a framework that we're hoping to undo now. And I absolutely think that our elected officials, by being selected by the residents of Fayetteville, are executing the will of the public in helping these organizations and efforts.
Do you, and this may not be a fair question, so you can wave me off if you would like. Do you feel like Fayetteville's philosophy in that area is different or consistent with other municipalities in Northwest Arkansas?
Uh, Depending which of the two parts you're talking about, the zoning, that's consistent almost nationwide, certainly in Northwest Arkansas, that a single family home is still one of the easiest things to build on a quarter or so acre lot. When it comes to funding initiatives like Fayetteville has chosen to do, from what I have seen, it's not consistently done to the same level across our region as it is in Fayetteville. And I think that's reflected in a lot of the services you see concentrated in Fayetteville, whether it's shelters, whether it's food services, whether it's the city's program to pay unhoused people to pick up trash. A lot of those are not, I don't want to say they're not valued elsewhere necessarily, but it seems that perhaps other fiscal responsibilities have taken priority.
I'm not going to ask you to respond to this. It does feel like Fayetteville, in many ways, shares a larger burden for some of those types of social issues than other municipalities in Northwest Arkansas. And so you definitely see a greater concentration. And I'm just speaking from my background, being involved in some of those types of issues as well too. But I won't force you to pass judgment or make a comment on that one. That'll be my bias for this episode. Maybe within that same vein, what are some of the other challenges that you see facing the city, Fayetteville, or Northwest Arkansas in general?
I think one of the more interesting challenges or tensions that I've seen lately, especially in Fayetteville, given some of the predilections of our residents and our elected officials, is the tension between our development needs and our growth needs and our natural environment. Uh, I say the predilections of Fayetteville. I mean, as a city, we value the natural environment. We, and I in dollar terms, in philosophical terms, you consistently see Fayetteville making outsized investments either in acquiring open spaces or upgrading our facilities like our West Side wastewater treatment plant to be have the cleanest effluent possible going to the Illinois River. Our development codes, which are considered very difficult to deal with by a lot of people in the region, are a reflection of those desires, whether it's to preserve trees, whether it's to enhance the water quality, leaving a parking lot. And that creates a lot of tension because as we see different weather patterns, regardless of your political view, the patterns are changing, whatever you think the cause is. We are needing to address those in our development codes to make sure our existing residents and future ones are not being negatively impacted by that. And that translates to possibly fewer developable pieces of land. And the pieces of land that are developable might have higher standards placed upon them. The easy flat land is almost all taken. So now we're talking about the not no longer the low hanging fruit, and our prioritization of infill properties or developing towards the interior of the city instead of the exterior is also inherently more difficult. Where you had one house and you replace it with two, there's more what we call impervious surfaces, more concrete rooftop, things that don't allow water to soak into the ground, is suddenly running off onto a neighbor. And so we say we want that kind of development, but at the same time we want to minimize impacts to neighbors. And so I think that's the tension I have found most interesting to watch. And I say interesting, also kind of painful, because again, one of my charges is to make sure development can occur in a smooth and effective way in the city. But also, I consider upholding our ordinances as a reflection of our community values as just as comparable charge. So it'll be interesting to continue to see where that goes. I found that doubly intriguing in just the 7 years I've been here to see some of our best practices and our ordinances be picked up by other cities in the region, and to some extent to a higher degree. I know Rogers, for example, requires homes in floodways or floodplains to be built up higher than in Fayetteville, which sounds like one little odd nuance, but the fact that it's happening at all shows that this is a conversation that's gaining speed elsewhere. And every time we take a piece of property out of developability, that's one less area we can build houses. That's one less area we can put an office or a retail space for jobs, which makes it inherently difficult to address our housing needs and our employment needs.
I'm curious if you think there are decisions that Northwest Arkansas or Fayetteville need to make within the next 5 or 10 years that are going to be really, really critical around planning, around growth, about what our quality of life looks like here.
Yes, the short answer. I think there certainly are. I also want to couch that in the fact that we are multiple different communities. And while I think there is absolutely fertile ground for a lot more collaboration, I also recognize that each community needs to maintain its own character. We don't all need to be a bunch of Fayettevilles. We don't all need to be a bunch of Bentonvilles or Centertons or whatever it may be. I think ensuring that all the cities in Fayetteville understand the consequences of how they grow is very important. That can seem very exciting to be in some of the smaller towns that are ballooning in size by hundreds of percents between biennial censuses sometimes. But if that growth is not either sustainable or fiscally responsible, we're setting up those communities and their residents for a lot of pain on the back end. We have the advantage of not growing up in the quickly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s like Los Angeles. We are seeing what a lot of those cities are dealing with now. Cities like Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that declared bankruptcy because of some of the infrastructure choices they made. So I think that conversation needs to find its way to the forefront, and I think that goes hand in hand with a lot of other issues in the area, especially housing. We absolutely can build houses from horizon to horizon, but that may get people in houses, but that may just be trading the cost of a home for higher costs in transportation. And so we've set them back in one way and move them forward in another. So being mindful of not just solving one problem gung ho with no regard for what other consequences we may be sending ourselves towards.
Maybe just because you mentioned the housing aspect, and the term affordable housing is, it's hard to throw a stone in Northwest Arkansas without running into that. issue. I'm curious how the city of Fayetteville, from a planning perspective, yeah, is approaching making housing more affordable.
Yeah, it's difficult. And what's considered affordable today is not what was affordable pre-COVID in 2019 and 2020. House prices are beyond what I could have imagined when I first moved here in 2016. Again, it gets back to that question, what is the city's role in housing? We don't currently build housing. We don't sell housing. We don't buy housing. We don't set the prices for housing. So a lot of what the conversation revolves around is supply and demand, which is absolutely overly reductive. I don't want to come off as an acolyte who says we just need to build more and we're going to solve our problem. But I think that is a big piece of it. If we stand still, if we continue business as usual, we're going to continue to see housing costs doing what they're doing. So I think one of the biggest roles that I have and that the people I work with have is the trying to find opportunities to build a lot more housing and do it in a responsible way. I mentioned it at the top of the conversation, what it looks like to build housing along some of our commercial corridors, especially those commercial corridors that are mostly surface parking lots, or they're mostly vacant buildings or buildings that have been for lease for years now. Those are absolutely right places to build housing. They're already located on streets. They're near jobs. They're near retail. We could, for lack of a nicer term, kill a few birds with one stone. We've got the housing. We're putting people closer to jobs. They could walk there instead of having to drive there. There's a lot of opportunities for that. So, in a sense, and to answer your question as simply as possible, increasing supply. But I also recognize that that's not all there is to the picture. If we just increase supply, we're just increasing market rate housing, and market rate housing is simply not affordable for a big portion of our population.
Are there policies in place that support or hinder Fayetteville from doing the work that it needs to in terms of land use planning to meet the needs for the next 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say so. As I alluded to earlier, we still have a figurative foot in the 60s and 70s and 80s in terms of some of our land use and zoning practices. I think that may be one of the biggest holdups. I think also our development code. So not necessarily what's allowed where, but what the things look like once they're built. The development code kind of straddles two worlds: the world of what I call greenfield development, which is new properties on the edge of town, old pastures, things like that, as opposed to infill development, which is redeveloping empty parking lots or tearing down a house, a dilapidated house, and replacing it with two new ones, things like that. Those are both very different types of development, and applying the same standards to both makes both more difficult. And I think that in that sense, our development code has a ways to go before it is necessarily making what we need easy, much less encouraging it.
When you think about the city of Fayetteville, are there places in the city where you're like, this is really special, this is really unique, this really exemplifies the direction that Fayetteville is going or would like to go?
I can't think of just one. No, I mean, I think that's one thing I like about Fayetteville is it feels like a city. It feels gritty. There's an element of organic development to it. It's not very cookie cutter. There are things that are ugly. There are things that are pretty, and both of those are subjective things. And someone may think the complete opposite of me. It's what makes Fayetteville most appealing to me of the four big cities in the region. Is I feel like I live in a genuine city. I know some people like say keep Fayetteville funky, but in a sense, there is some of that. There's a lot of people showing their personality and their preferences in how their homes look and how their buildings look and how their businesses look, and that's something I appreciate as I move throughout the city, not just a single particular place.
I try to ask everybody this question that I've had the chance to talk with, and it's a simple question, but the question is this: what do you fear for this place?
It sounds protective in a negative way, but I fear Fayetteville losing its character. And when I say I don't like sounding protective in that, it sounds like I don't want more people to live here. I don't want new neighbors. I don't think there should be new residents, because what makes Fayetteville special is what's here now. And I don't mean that when I say that. I fear that what Fayetteville, I feel, are the character of Fayetteville being diluted either by problems that are out of our control, whether it's national trends and housing prices, things like that. I fear the city making decisions, financial, fiscal decisions that compromise our ability to continue investing in the things we value. Um, it's a good question. I definitely don't think there's one thing that keeps me up at night necessarily. It's probably an accumulation of things that are really hard to define.
One of the terms we use around this conversation is the term wholeness. And I'd love from your perspective, what does wholeness look like in the work that you're doing?
Mm. I think that's a watchword for what planners or good, I almost use a subjective term, effective planners should be doing. They should be thinking holistically. They should be thinking comprehensively. When you look at a land use decision, you shouldn't just be weighing what's on the property versus what could be on the property. You need to look at the impacts to the community, the impacts to the infrastructure, all those things. Uh, so I think wholeness in that regard means looking at our city as a system, not as a series of one-off decisions. I think that's probably how I would have to summarize it.
Yeah, the interconnect. Well, I shouldn't answer for you. It sounds like the interconnectedness of all of the elements coming together.
I think so, yeah. And to your earlier comment about what I see from day to day, that's exactly what I see from day to day. You make a decision or you make a code change or the council makes a decision, and you can see rolling impacts from that. Hopefully mostly intended, but sometimes unintended, and sometimes years in the making. I mean, we make code changes that sometimes I feel like we only see the true impacts of them years later. For example, we eliminated our non-residential parking requirements in 2015, and it was probably only the last 3 or 4 years that we've started to kind of see the effects of that, the realization that that actually exists both nationally and locally. So the need to try to keep your eye both in front of your face and over the horizon is encapsulates a lot of what wholeness means in this profession or in this position.
What am I not asking you within the scope of this conversation that we either need to talk about or needs to be brought up or maybe needs to be reinforced?
Oh, I don't know. It's something that I could answer with dozens and dozens of things that may be of the most minute amount of interest to an audience or to a very high degree. I think I think it is important for people to realize the implications of laws on what appears in on the urban landscape in your city, in your neighborhood. Everything, oh, just about everything you see is because of some rule in a book somewhere. And to not pay attention to those things can lead to a lot of frustrations or anger or angst down the road. And that's not necessarily an aspiration for me to or a call to arms from people to come protest everything that's being proposed. But I think it's important for people to understand that when you see a driveway where it's located, when you see a sidewalk where it's located, or a street tree where it's located, those are all written in a book somewhere dictating prescriptively where they go. And if people take issue with those or have concerns with those, that they need to become more involved. And that can be showing up at a public hearing, or it can be volunteering to be on a resident committee. We've got many of them in Fayetteville for any number of topics. So that's something I always want to impress upon people is when you're driving around town complaining about something, there's a good chance that you can have something to do about it, or you could have had something to do about it.
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you for your time to lay this out. And I realize there's a lot of people involved in making Fayetteville what an incredible place that it is. And as you sit in this space, and I know that you also have a large responsibility in this space as well for making beautiful what an amazing place it is. And so I would join you in hoping and working towards the hope that Fayetteville doesn't change. It only continues to be reinforced in the character that it is and a really special place that it is. So thank you for your time and thank you for the work that you're doing. And thanks for doing it with what sounds like incredible excellence in that. And so thank you.
You bet. Appreciate you wanting to learn more.
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, huge thanks to Jonathan Curth again for his time. But before we recap this episode, I want to share a conversation that I had with long-term Fayetteville resident John Ray. We took a bike ride through the city of Fayetteville, and I will have to apologize for any heavy breathing you hear. There are a few more hills in Fayetteville than I'm used to in Bentonville. John Ray, good morning.
Good morning.
How you doing this morning?
Awesome. Beautiful day in the Ozarks. Where are we today? We are on the iconic downtown square in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Fayetteville's been my home for the last 20 plus years, and love it here. It's a cool, borderline, kind of feels like spring kind of day, doesn't it? It really does. What happens down here in the spring on the square? Man, this place explodes with flowers and blossoms and farmers markets and dogs and people from all over coming down on Saturday morning, Tuesday mornings, Thursday mornings. It's really a cultural hub for the city. Sounds like a pretty great place to be any time of the year, but especially in the spring. It really is. So Fayetteville's home for you though, huh? Yeah, I can't imagine really living anywhere else in Northwest Arkansas. Fayetteville specifically, but I mean, all of Northwest Arkansas, there's lots going on here. I lived in Fayetteville a long time ago when I was a student. It's been many years. This place has changed a lot. It's a beautiful place. Well, I'm sure you spent a lot of time on Dixon Street, which we're coming up on right now. Well, I can't really talk about that, John. Well, the interesting thing to me about Dixon Street is, in some ways, it's a microcosm of the whole town. It's three of the largest churches on one end, university on the other end, and all the bars in between. Sinners and saints, something like that, all together. I may have to ask you where you put yourself in that categorization. All three. Sinners, saints, and somewhere in between. Sounds like an album cover right there. Or a country song. John's my only friend with a Rodeo Labs bike. It makes him special. Taking me up the hill first. I remember this being part of the bargain. So the reason why I want to go here, this is the Mountain Award Historic District, and it speaks to the wealth that was originally here as the county seat. University grew up, but this whole area has a lot of really well-preserved homes. That's beautiful. It hasn't changed much in 7,500 years. Okay, John, you're pointing me right, but that's like a 15% grade. These Bentonville legs aren't ready for these Fayetteville hills. Yeah, it's beautiful up here. You're really at the top of the whole city here. And we had to go over this hill. We couldn't have gone around it. So now we're coming up on Wilson Park. And one of the things I just learned recently, this area down here where the pool is, all that used to be flooded. So it was a giant lake down there where they had pavilions and boats and swimming. And somewhere along the way, they took the dam away and let all that water just run into the creek. But I imagine it could have been a lot like Barton Springs is in Austin. Yeah, I've never actually pictured it as potentially like you just described. So even here in downtown Fayetteville, this is Skull Creek. It flows through Wilson Park. Yes, part of the Illinois River watershed. We're coming up on the northwest corner of the park, which is the famous castle. It was a favorite of ours as a family when the girls were younger. Yeah, it was just a place with some great memories, huh? It really is. Did a lot of girls' birthday parties here. Give this another month and there'll be blankets spread out, and hammocks strung, all kinds of dogs. But we play around there quite a bit. John, what brought you to Fayetteville in the first place? I moved to Northwest Arkansas in 1988 and was going to be here for a year. And even out of that year, I was going to be traveling quite a bit. There was a group up here that did some nonprofit work, Central America. And when I got here in 1988, nothing like it is today. Very rural. Everybody went to Kansas City or Little Rock or Tulsa if they needed anything significant. But comparing to where I grew up in Austin, what was Austin like at the time? Do you remember? So that was like, well, that's interesting because the longer I've been here, the more this reminds me of the Austin I grew up in, which I grew up during the boom days, 70s, 80s, where it was just taking off in so many ways. And so seeing the growth in Northwest Arkansas really excites me. It's also really daunting. Explain. Well, look, I say this not because I'm super smart or anything, but you know where this is going to go. This pattern of rapid urbanization of rural spaces has been done time and time again across this country. It's not rocket science. And sure, each area has specific nuances and things, but the pattern is pretty much the same. Concentrating of wealth into the urban centers and resources, and then just unfettered sprawl in the unincorporated areas right outside the city limits. And no good deed goes unpunished, right? The desire of planners in those urban cores to maintain the uniqueness, the character by more and more regulation, many necessary, pushes this just incredible demand for more affordability outside of the city. It drives cost up. The closer you get to the center, it becomes more exclusive, no matter how hard you try to preserve it. John, how has that kind of growth, what have you seen over the years? Well, as wealth and resources increase in density in the urban core, you see the people that make those things run forced further and further out, more and more just isolated. Yeah. Pockets of uniformity without diversity. Yeah. We're at the Mount Sequoia Cross. Catch our breath. Fayetteville is sometimes called the city of seven hills on the mistaken notion that there are 7 hills that surround the city, which was supposed to allude to the 7 hills of Rome. Now, if you look at the map, there's more than 7 hills, and people are unsure which ones are which. Mount Sequoia, definitely one of them. Probably chief among them, really. But from here, we can see Markham Hill. We can see Centennial Park. We can see Kessler Mountain. You can see the water tower in Siloam Springs. You see the University of the Downtown. I mean, if you want to get a layout in a way of Fayetteville, there's probably no better single place to do it than right here at top of Mount Sequoia to cross.
Yeah, if we were standing here 50 years from today, what would this place look like?
Well, all the way through that gap, which runs down MLK, all we'll see is buildings and probably high rises, actually, with that. Because I doubt one of the things that concentrates the wealth is the limiting of the space.
Meaning like the geography of where Fayetteville sits, there's just not a lot of room to go outside of that.
Right, and we also have a lot of historic buildings that are going to be preserved. So they're not going to be torn down to build bigger buildings. And then Fayetteville, for all its claims to be liberal and progressive and welcoming, has a very strong NIMBY contingent.
Yeah, not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard with that. Which, you understand. I get it. Everybody's got ways they think. But one of the ways to alleviate, like I said earlier, it's not rocket science. One of the ways to alleviate some of the worst of urban sprawl is to allow for denser zoning and build out through undeveloped areas that aren't specifically preserved as park or community space.
So we're turning left here on Spring Street, which has been in the news lately because this is the hopefully future Black Historic District that they're working on.
Is it this left?
No, we'll go straight.
So this is kind of the base of the holler.
This is the base, huh? So this is, we're in the area that's going to be the Black Historic District. Yeah,
so you have
this down in the bottom of this little valley, huh?
This is where St. James African American Church was originally.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know that I've ever been down here.
Then you have the federal funded housing projects.
Go straight up, turn left on East Rock Street.
All right.
So this is St. James.
Wow. But you can see the county courthouse is there and the jail was there. And then the formerly enslaved population,
kind of down to our right here,
was constrained within this area. I don't know the specifics if there was specific redlining. Here's a food pantry pickup that goes quite a bit.
It says go left, Rock Street.
It's another climb, sorry.
That's okay. I have been up here.
Oh, well, then you know what's up there then.
Well, I do.
So just arriving here at the gate to the Confederate cemetery here on Rock Street, displaying the Confederate soldier memorial and a Confederate flag. You imagine you're part of the African American community. Look up one hill, you've got the courthouse, symbol of Jim Crow justice. Look up on the other hill, Confederate soldier. Yeah, I've never looked at it that way before, John, but I mean, they were boxed in on every side. I mean, you talk about intimidation. You talk about oppression spiritual, physical, however you want to call it, systemic. I mean, let's just box in people with this stuff. So this is the work that's being done on cemetery restoration. They're finding black graves here on the top side of this. I guess the only maybe symbolic good is that the unknown formerly enslaved people that are buried here are buried above the people that tried to keep them in bondage, and maybe in their final resting place they were able to rest at a place of overcoming. Sorry about that. No, this is part of the journey, man. We have to have I didn't know it was going to be so personal.
Hey, this is Mike. I want to interrupt for a moment. This is a point in the ride when we are leaving Rock Street. This is where East Mountain Cemetery and the Confederate Cemetery are located. I wanted to interrupt because first, I want to let you know we're going to come back to this in a future episode. Because one of the framing principles that I laid out in episode 2, The Invitation, is that we cannot be whole without connecting to our place and our community in an honest and authentic way. And we need to be honest about history in places like this. Second, in the spirit of this communal theology of place and trying to understand how it's formed, in episode 2, I said that before we as a community can go forward, we have to reconnect to these stories. These stories need to be remembered. Some we may need to be more honest about, and some we may need to repair. Well, this location, like the crossroads on Little Sugar Creek, holds these kinds of stories. This is me starting to reconnect with these stories. This is a story that we need to repair, because that work is not complete. So we'll continue with this ride, but it didn't feel right to simply move on from here without a word that we will come back to this story in future episode.
So what road is it? Is this wood? I think this might be willow. I'm not sure, but this is all through the extension. Yeah. Now this is the area they're now calling Bill District area, South Fayetteville, that is quickly becoming gentrified. This is the old Jefferson Elementary. So it was Jefferson Elementary, then it got phased out, became an adult learning center. So Jefferson Elementary was
Jefferson, like Thomas, or?
Yep. Was the historic black school, African-American school in the city.
So a former slave owner.
Yep.
Name on the historic black school.
Sharp left. Yeah.
Okay, where are we right now? So we're way South Fayetteville down here.
So we're just south of the street.
Okay.
Heading on the right out to the crown jewel of all mountain biking probably of North America. I mean, I would say Mount Kessler is the crown jewel of mountain biking in North America.
Part of me wants to edit that comment. Part of me is just going to leave it in so that we can have this debate settled once and for all by listening to how dumb that sounds.
Hey, look, I know people who just aren't technically able enough to write it, talk shit about it, but,
I'm sure Kessler's great in its own way. But you forget where I live, John. I live in the mountain bike capital of the world. You know what we're going to do is we're going to have an episode about a case study about how mountain bike trails divide people. And this is what it's going to be about. It's going to be about trail zoning, land use plans around trails.
Here, let's just turn around here. It's still really muddy. But Traverse winds back up there.
Okay.
And then out to Kessler.
Okay. You're sparing me from Kessler?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not casting my pearls before swine.
John, what does Fayetteville mean to you?
It could be projection, Mike, but I see my own aspirations for the kind of community I want to live in, embodied in a lot of Fayetteville. We were just up looking at the Confederate Cemetery and talking about that. But Fayetteville High was also the first high school to integrate in the state. And so it's not a one-sided story. It's a complicated story. And there are people here a good number of people that really want to do right and want to live in harmony and want to have equality and they want to have opportunity for everybody. You know, we laughed about it earlier. Honestly, I see churches, bars, theaters, and a university all sharing the same street as a good thing, something to be aspired to. And segregating people out further and further out in cookie cutter suburb.
John, hold on. I mean, that's a pretty strong word to use, the word segregation, or to segregate people out. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, because you can't use racial segregation as a motivation for planning, right? That's good. That's a good thing. The bad thing is we've just replaced a certain economic demographics that stands in for that. And sure, it's not all one race, but it tends heavily to be that race. And so we use economic things as a stand. And I know there's when I start talking like that, people go, well, what's your answer? What are you going to do? How are you going to change it? And
I'm okay to just have a conversation that it's real first.
well, that's what you got to do. You can't deny it. Because Mike, no matter how deep you bury the bodies, they're going to come back. Now we're going to head up Big City and go back.
I'll ask you this, because I ask everybody this. What are your fears for this place?
People get tired. People give up. People just accept. It's just always going to be the way it is. I mean, I go back to Austin. It's unrecognizable from the place I grew up.
If Fayetteville turns into Austin, what have we lost?
Our uniqueness. We'll lose a unique way of being in the world, a Fayetteville way of moving through the world, seeing the world, engaging with the world, just to be replaced with a generic modern economic machine.
John, for Fayetteville, from your point of view, what does wholeness look like?
And I know you're going to ding me on being generic here, but it is so different for everybody, but it involves having the community of people and resources and opportunity that you need to flourish. You've got wholeness. You cannot be whole in isolation. You have to have community. You cannot be whole without the resources, availability of resources. And you cannot be whole without the opportunities there. Like it just, that's what it takes. And I know that's a big ask. I know for a lot of people that may seem unattainable, but I think we've been told that, hey, just pursue one of these and everything will be okay. And that's part of the big dysfunction is that you're not okay. You're not okay. You're not okay without community. You're not okay without opportunity. You're not okay without the resources. And that's why, again, why it's so depressing to me that our current state of political affairs become so entrenched, we can't even talk about it. We can't agree that there's a problem. It's, I don't know, it's a big app.
Well, John, thanks for sharing your city with me. It's a beautiful place. I love seeing it through your eyes. I've lived here for a long time and been to Fayetteville many times. And this may be the most unique experience of seeing Fayetteville as someone who calls this place home. So I'm deeply grateful. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thanks for being a proud resident of Fayetteville. Thanks for being a culture creator to help this place thrive and become all that it can be. So thanks for your time, John. Appreciate it.
I love what you do. I'm curious.
Thank you, my friend.
Well, a big thank you to both Jonathan and John for their time and insights into how the city of Fayetteville is being shaped from the eyes of both a city planner and a person who has been there for a very long time and has lived with the decisions made and seeing the impact of the planning that's been done. In my talk with Jonathan, I learned a lot, and I really appreciate how Jonathan's long-range view of the city has come together. He really seems to hold together all the different and sometimes competing points of view and interests from citizens and elected officials. And he is clearly working so hard to keep Fayetteville, Fayetteville, despite all the pressure that is placed on the challenges that he is involved in finding solutions for. And then my ride with John. As anyone who knows him, he's a gift to spend time with. However, that's not the only reason I wanted to have him lead me around Fayetteville. Yes, it's John's home, But he's also been active in helping to plan safe infrastructure and trails within the city. This involvement isn't just an engaged citizen. To John, it's deeply personal. If you read John's guest bio, you would know that in October of 2009, John's youngest daughter, Olivia, was tragically killed at a crosswalk a mile from their home in Fayetteville. Since then, much of the Ray family's ministry efforts have been focused on various projects supported through Olivia's Basket, which is part of the nonprofit that he and his wife Jane lead, called the Abide Collective. I would encourage you to spend some time learning more about the work of Olivia's Basket and the Abide Collective. I'll put links in the episode notes section of the episode webpage. John and his family are a gift, not only to me, but also to my family. The Ray family is just one of those families that when they talk, you listen. When they invite you into something, you accept. And when you are greeted with a hug, you hug right back because you know that you're accepted, welcome, and loved. Trust me, you'll hear from John again as we take this journey together. He has a lot more stories to tell. And for the route this week, I won't go into more detail because John just took us all through it. But the route is posted, and we've got a lot of really great things that you can go and do and experience and see the city the way that I saw it. I would just say that the only thing I would add to this is just be prepared for the Fayetteville Hills. It took me about 10 minutes to edit out all my swearing. You'll find the route for this episode in the episode webpage. For our next episode, we're going to be talking with someone who is working to find creative solutions to affordable housing. Actually, they're trying to find creative solutions on how to include people in our community. To do that, it means we have to first truly understand why housing is this challenge. We need to understand what life looks like for a large part of the people of Northwest Arkansas. So far, we've heard from 4 community leaders talk about the growth of the region and how the region's prosperity is maybe one of the biggest challenges we have. Because for many in our community, that prosperity remains out of reach. The reality is that more than 150,000 people in Benton, Madison, and Washington County face financial insecurity, housing instability, and a host of other challenges every single day. These people need tangible, lasting change in our systems that shape our lives. They need someone to fight for that change right now. So to take us through the issues and potential solutions, we sit down with Jeff Webster. Jeff is the CEO and president of the Accelerate Foundation.
That's the point here, folks, is you don't realize what's going on in our community. And these are hardworking people, but they just can't access housing. And you look at far and away the number one thing that people come to us, I'm having trouble paying rent. It's the single biggest thing someone's going to pay. Where this starts to go is it just dominates what everyone needs help with. And even for our board, they're like, well, how is housing a social determinant of health? But we always say the first doctor bill and the first copay someone pays is to the landlord, because you don't pay that landlord, you're living under a bridge or something. I'll never ask this question again on why housing is this big dominant part of a healthcare outcome.
I can't wait to share that episode with you. So we'll close today with the music of Lone Social. This is a duo based out of Arkansas, Jacob Evans and Cooper Clark, who have a unique sound, and we hope you'll really enjoy the work that they're doing. We obviously love featuring local musicians, and their single, Slow It Down, is something that maybe we all need to consider as we work through how we all fit within this community.